Teenagers shoved a 90-year-old veteran into the street. 20 minutes later, the Marines surrounded them. "Get out of the way, old man." The teenager's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade as he deliberately shoulder-checked 90-year-old Walter "Gunny" Adams, sending the frail veteran stumbling toward the busy street. "Nobody wants to see your wrinkled face around here. If this incredible story of justice and military brotherhood inspires you, please like and subscribe for more amazing tales that prove heroes never truly retire." Walter Adams felt his worn combat boots slip on the wet pavement as the impact sent him careening toward the traffic on Main Street. At 90 years old, with a Purple Heart earned at Iwo Jima and a lifetime of service to his country behind him, he had survived Japanese artillery machine gun nests and 3 tours of duty in the Pacific Theater. But in this moment, he was just a fragile old man being terrorized by a pack of teenagers who saw his age as weakness rather than wisdom. "Please," Walter gasped, his arthritic hands reaching out to steady himself against a lamppost as car horns blared and drivers swerved to avoid hitting him. "I'm just trying to get to the bakery. I don't want any trouble." The leader of the group, a 17-year-old with dead eyes and a sneer that spoke of countless acts of casual cruelty, stepped closer to Walter with the predatory confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "Trouble, old man, you are the trouble. This is our street, and we don't want your kind shuffling around here, making the place look bad." Behind him, 4 other teenagers laughed and recorded the encounter on their phones, their faces lit up with the kind of malicious joy that comes from tormenting someone who can't fight back. They ranged in age from 15 to 18, all of them products of broken homes and failed systems, all of them united in their contempt for authority, respect, and the values that Walter's generation had died to protect. "My kind," Walter's voice carried a note of steel that his tormentors were too young and too ignorant to recognize as dangerous. "Son, my kind stormed beaches and liberated concentration camps. My kind built the world you're living in." The teenager's response was to shove Walter harder, this time with both hands, sending the veteran stumbling into the street where a delivery truck missed him by inches. As Walter struggled to regain his footing, his Marine Corps cap fell from his head and landed in a puddle, the Eagle Globe and anchor emblem that had meant everything to him for 70 years, now soaked and trampled under the feet of punks who had never sacrificed anything for anyone. But what these teenagers didn't know was that Walter Adams wasn't just any old man. He was a Marine, and Marines never traveled alone, even when they thought they did. Walter "Gunny" Adams had never imagined that his golden years would be spent dodging teenagers instead of enemy fire. After serving 26 years in the Marine Corps, rising from private to gunnery sergeant through a combination of battlefield courage and unwavering dedication to his Marines, Walter had earned the right to walk the streets of his hometown with dignity and respect. His service record read like a history of American military valor in the 20th century. Enlisted at 17 in 1943, he had fought at Iwo Jima as a 19-year-old private, where he had earned his Purple Heart pulling wounded Marines to safety under heavy Japanese fire. Korea had followed, then 2 tours in Vietnam as a seasoned NCO, responsible for training young Marines and keeping them alive in the jungles of Southeast Asia. But it was his role as a drill instructor at Parris Island that had defined the second half of Walter's career. For 15 years, he had transformed civilians into Marines, instilling in thousands of young men the values of honor, courage, and commitment that would carry them through combat and beyond. His Marines had gone on to serve with distinction in conflicts around the world, and many of them had returned to tell him that his training had saved their lives. The small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, where Walter had chosen to spend his retirement, had once been the kind of place where veterans were honored and elders were respected. But like many American communities, it had changed over the decades, becoming a place where traditional values were mocked and where groups of idle teenagers felt entitled to terrorize anyone they perceived as weak or vulnerable. The 5 teenagers who had targeted Walter were part of a larger problem that local law enforcement seemed unable or unwilling to address. Led by Tyler Morrison, a 17-year-old with a juvenile record that included vandalism, theft, and assault, the group had been terrorizing residents for months with impunity. They gathered daily at the corner of Main and Elm, blocking sidewalks, intimidating pedestrians, and engaging in the kind of casual cruelty that had become their primary source of entertainment. Tyler's followers were Marcus Chen, 16, whose parents worked double shifts and had no idea what their son was doing after school. Jamie Rodriguez, 15, who had been failed by every adult authority figure in his life and had learned to trust only in violence. Devin Williams, 18, who should have graduated but had dropped out to pursue a career in petty crime. And Alex Thompson, 17, whose wealthy parents had given him everything except discipline and consequences. What made their behavior particularly galling was that Millbrook was home to a significant veteran population, including several Medal of Honor recipients and hundreds of men and women who had served their country with distinction. The town's main street was lined with memorials to local heroes, and the annual Veterans Day Parade was one of the community's most cherished traditions. But these teenagers had grown up in an era when military service was voluntary rather than universal, when wars were fought by a small percentage of the population while the majority remained unaffected. To them, veterans like Walter were relics from a bygone era, old men whose stories were boring and whose presence was an inconvenience rather than a source of pride and gratitude. The confrontation that would change everything began on a Tuesday afternoon in November, just 2 weeks before Veterans Day. Walter had been making his weekly trip to Rossetti's Bakery, a journey that had become one of his few remaining pleasures since his wife Margaret's death the previous year. The bakery was 6 blocks from his apartment, a walk that took him past the War Memorial, where he often stopped to pay his respects to fallen comrades whose names were etched in granite. Walter had been looking forward to his usual conversation with Maria Rossetti, whose grandfather had served with the Italian resistance during World War II. Maria always saved him a loaf of the Italian bread that reminded him of his deployment to the Mediterranean, and she never failed to thank him for his service with the kind of genuine gratitude that had become increasingly rare in his daily interactions. But as Walter approached the corner of Main and Elm, he saw the familiar cluster of teenagers who had made that intersection their territory. He had encountered them before enduring their snickers and crude comments about his age and appearance, but he had always managed to pass by without serious incident. Today, however, something was different. The teenagers seemed more aggressive, more hostile, as if they were looking for trouble rather than simply causing it through their presence. "Well, well, well," Tyler Morrison had said as Walter approached, stepping directly into the veteran's path and forcing him to stop. "Look what we have here. It's the old soldier boy shuffling off to buy his prune juice and denture cream." Walter had tried to maintain his dignity, drawing on decades of military bearing to project calm authority despite his physical frailty. "Excuse me, son. I'd like to pass, please." The respectful tone of Walter's request had only seemed to inflame Tyler's contempt. Son, you don't get to call me son, old man. I'm not your son, and I don't have to show you any respect just because you're ancient." The other teenagers had formed a semicircle around Walter, trapping him against a storefront, while pedestrians hurried past, unwilling to get involved in what appeared to be a confrontation between generations. Walter had felt the familiar chill of being surrounded by hostiles, but this time he was 90 years old and armed only with a walking stick rather than an M1 Garand. "I fought for this country," Walter had said quietly, hoping to appeal to whatever sense of patriotism or respect these young men might possess. "I served so that you could have the freedom to stand on this street corner." Tyler's response had been immediate and vicious. "Nobody asked you to fight for anything, old man. Nobody asked you to be a hero, and nobody cares about your ancient history." The verbal assault had escalated when Jamie Rodriguez had snatched Walter's Marine Corps cap from his head, examining the Eagle Globe, an anchor emblem, with mock curiosity. "What's this supposed to be, some kind of bird?" "That's the Marine Corps emblem," Walter had replied, reaching for his cap with hands that trembled with age and suppressed rage. "Please give it back." Instead, Jamie had tossed the cap to Marcus Chen, who had thrown it to Devin Williams, turning Walter's most precious possession into a prop in their cruel game of keep-away. As Walter had tried to retrieve his cap, moving slowly and unsteadily between the laughing teenagers, Tyler had made the decision that would seal his fate. "You want your little hat back, Grandpa? Go get it." Tyler had shoved Walter with both hands, sending the 90-year-old veteran stumbling into the street where traffic was moving at 35 miles per hour. Only Walter's combat reflexes, honed by decades of training and sharpened by years of mortal danger, had allowed him to avoid being struck by the delivery truck that had swerved at the last second. As Walter lay in the street, his cap trampled and his dignity shattered, he had made a decision that would bring the full weight of Marine Corps justice down on Tyler Morrison and his crew. Walter Adams picked himself up from the wet pavement with the same determination that had carried him through the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima 78 years earlier. His body was battered and his pride was wounded, but his spirit remained unbroken. As the teenagers continued their cruel laughter and moved on to find other victims, Walter retrieved his soaked Marine Corps cap and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going home to nurse his injuries and his humiliation, Walter walked directly to the Marine Corps recruiting station located 3 blocks away on Veterans Boulevard. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was behind the desk when Walter entered, and she immediately recognized the bearing of a fellow Marine, despite his age and civilian clothes. "Good afternoon, Marine," Santos said, coming to her feet with the respect that one Marine always showed another. "How can I help you today?" Walter's voice was steady despite his ordeal. "Staff Sergeant, I need to report an incident involving disrespect to the uniform and assault on a Marine veteran. I'm Gunnery Sergeant Walter Adams, retired, and I've just been attacked by a group of civilians who showed deliberate contempt for the Corps and everything we stand for." Santos listened with growing anger as Walter recounted the incident, her jaw tightening with each detail of the teenager's behavior. When Walter finished his report, Santos was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had heard and considering the appropriate response. "Gunny," Santos said, finally using the traditional title of respect for a gunnery sergeant. "What you've described is not just an assault on you personally. It's an attack on every Marine who has ever worn the uniform. These punks need to understand that when they disrespect one Marine, they disrespect all Marines." Santos picked up her phone and began making calls. Within minutes, she had contacted Gunnery Sergeant Mike Jackson at the nearby Marine Corps Air Station, Sergeant First Class Tony Rodriguez, who was home on leave, and several other Marines who lived and worked in the Millbrook area. The message was simple: a Marine veteran had been assaulted and disrespected, and the Corps was going to respond. The response was swift and overwhelming. Within an hour, 8 active duty Marines and 4 veterans had assembled at the recruiting station, all of them volunteers who had dropped whatever they were doing to support a fellow Marine in need. They ranged in rank from Lance Corporal to Master Sergeant, and they represented deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and conflicts around the world. Gunnery Sergeant Jackson, a 20-year veteran with 3 combat tours, and the kind of presence that made seasoned Marines snap to attention, took charge of the situation. "Gentlemen, we have a 90-year-old Marine veteran who was assaulted by a group of punks who think they can disrespect the uniform without consequences. We're going to educate these young men about the error of their ways." The Marines spent the next hour gathering intelligence about Tyler Morrison and his crew, using their network of contacts and their investigative skills to learn everything they could about the teenagers who had targeted Walter. What they discovered was a pattern of behavior that included intimidation of elderly residents, vandalism of veteran memorials, and a general contempt for authority that had gone unchecked by local law enforcement. "These kids have been terrorizing this community for months," Jackson reported to his assembled Marines. "They vandalized the Korean War Memorial, harassed World War II veterans at the VFW, and basically turned downtown Millbrook into their personal playground. Local police have been ineffective, and the kids think they're untouchable." Staff Sergeant Santos had been coordinating with local authorities, and she had learned that Tyler Morrison and his crew would be gathering at their usual spot on Main and Elm at approximately 4:10 p.m. "They're creatures of habit," she reported. "Same time, same place every day. They think they own that corner." Jackson's plan was simple and effective. "We're going to surround them, isolate them from any potential support, and have a conversation about respect, honor, and the consequences of their actions. No violence, no threats, just a professional discussion between Marines and civilians about appropriate behavior." The Marines prepared for their mission with the same attention to detail that they would bring to a combat operation. They studied the terrain, identified escape routes and potential complications, and established communication protocols that would ensure coordination and control throughout the encounter. At 3:45 p.m., 12 Marines in civilian clothes took positions around the intersection of Main and Elm, invisible to casual observation, but positioned to control every avenue of approach and retreat. When Tyler Morrison and his crew arrived at their usual gathering spot, they walked directly into a carefully planned Marine Corps operation. The moment that changed everything came at exactly 4:07 p.m., when Tyler Morrison looked up from his phone to find himself surrounded by 12 of the most intimidating men he had ever encountered. The Marines had materialized from doorways, alleys, and parked cars with the silent precision of a special operations team, forming a perfect circle around the five teenagers, who suddenly found themselves trapped in the middle of Main Street. Gunnery Sergeant Jackson stepped forward, his bearing unmistakably military, despite his civilian clothes. At 6'3", with the kind of physical presence that came from 2 decades of Marine Corps training, Jackson commanded attention simply by existing in the same space as other people. "Gentlemen," Jackson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "we need to have a conversation about respect and consequences. You're going to listen, and you're going to learn." Tyler Morrison, who had felt invincible just moments before, suddenly understood that he was facing something far more dangerous than the elderly veteran he had assaulted. These were warriors, and they were not pleased with his behavior. "We didn't do anything wrong," Tyler said, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to project the same confidence he had shown when terrorizing Walter Adams. "This is a free country, and we have the right to be here." Jackson's response was delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that made even experienced Marines pay attention. "Son, you absolutely have the right to be here. What you don't have is the right to assault elderly veterans, disrespect the uniform, or terrorize the community that those veterans fought to protect." Staff Sergeant Santos stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded Marines in combat. "20 minutes ago, you pushed a 90-year-old Marine veteran into traffic. Gunnery Sergeant Walter Adams served his country for 26 years, fought at Iwo Jima, and earned the Purple Heart defending the freedom that you just used to assault him." The revelation that Walter was not just any elderly man, but a decorated Marine veteran hit the teenagers like a physical blow. Marcus Chen, whose grandfather had immigrated from China, seeking the freedom that American veterans had died to protect, looked sick as he realized the magnitude of what they had done. "We didn't know he was a Marine," Jamie Rodriguez said weakly, as if ignorance could excuse their behavior. Master Sergeant Tony Rodriguez, who shared no relation to Jamie, but felt a deep shame at the boy's use of his family name, stepped closer to the teenager. "You didn't need to know he was a Marine to treat him with respect. You needed to know he was a human being, an elderly man who deserved your courtesy and protection, not your contempt and violence." The turning point came when Jackson pulled out his phone and showed the teenagers a photograph of Walter Adams in his dress blue uniform taken during his retirement ceremony in 1969. The image showed a proud Marine surrounded by the men he had trained and led, his chest covered with ribbons that represented decades of honorable service. "This is the man you assaulted," Jackson said, his voice growing harder with each word. "Gunnery Sergeant Walter Adams, Purple Heart recipient, veteran of Iwo Jima, Korea, and Vietnam. He trained thousands of Marines, saved countless lives, and served his country with honor for 26 years. And you pushed him into traffic because you thought it would be funny." Devin Williams, the oldest of the group at 18, began to understand that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "What do you want from us?" Jackson's response revealed the true purpose of the Marine intervention. "We want you to understand what you've done, and we want you to make it right. You're going to apologize to Gunnery Sergeant Adams. You're going to show proper respect to every veteran in this community, and you're going to learn what it means to serve something bigger than yourselves." The confrontation had attracted the attention of local residents and business owners, many of whom had been terrorized by Tyler's crew for months. They watched from doorways and windows as 12 Marines delivered a lesson in respect and accountability that the local authorities had been unable or unwilling to provide. "You have a choice," Jackson continued. "You can learn from this experience and become better men, or you can continue down the path you're on and face the consequences that come with disrespecting those who serve. But understand this, every veteran in this community is under our protection, and if you harm or disrespect any of them again, you'll answer to us." The psychological impact of being surrounded by 12 Marines was immediate and overwhelming for Tyler Morrison and his crew. These teenagers, who had felt invincible when terrorizing elderly residents and intimidating civilians, suddenly found themselves face to face with men who had faced actual combat and emerged victorious. The difference in presence confidence and moral authority was so stark that it shattered their self-image as tough guys who could do whatever they wanted without consequences. Tyler, who had been the leader of the group through his willingness to escalate violence and his contempt for authority, found himself unable to maintain eye contact with Gunnery Sergeant Jackson. The Marine's steady gaze seemed to see right through him, recognizing him for what he was, a coward who preyed on the weak because he lacked the courage to face real challenges. "I want you to think about something," Jackson said, his voice carrying the weight of experience and authority. Gunnery Sergeant Adams was 19 years old when he stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima. 19. That's younger than some of you. While you're spending your time terrorizing old men and vandalizing memorials, he was facing down Japanese machine guns and pulling wounded Marines to safety under enemy fire. Staff Sergeant Santos stepped forward with a folder containing documents that the Marines had gathered during their intelligence preparation. Tyler Morrison, age 17, arrested twice for vandalism, once for theft, currently on probation for assault. Marcus Chen, age 16, suspended from school 3 times this year for fighting and disrespecting teachers. Jamie Rodriguez, age 15, already in the juvenile system for destruction of property. The recitation of their records was devastating to the teenagers' self-image. They had thought of themselves as rebels and outcasts, but the Marines saw them clearly as petty criminals and bullies who had never faced real consequences for their actions. "You think you're tough?" Master Sergeant Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from leading Marines in combat. "You think pushing around 90-year-old men makes you warriors? Let me tell you what tough really looks like." Rodriguez began describing the actions that had earned Walter Adams his Purple Heart, painting a picture of courage and sacrifice that was so far beyond the teenagers' experience that they could barely comprehend it. He crawled through enemy fire for 6 hours, pulling wounded Marines to safety one by one. He took shrapnel in his leg and kept fighting. He saved 17 lives that day, and he never talked about it because that's what Marines do. We serve without seeking recognition. The contrast between Walter's heroism and their own cowardly behavior was so stark that several of the teenagers began to show visible signs of shame and remorse. Alex Thompson, whose wealthy parents had shielded him from consequences, his entire life was crying openly as he realized the magnitude of what they had done. "What happens now?" Devin Williams asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jackson's response was carefully calculated to provide both accountability and redemption. "Now you're going to learn what it means to serve your community instead of terrorizing it. You're going to volunteer at the VA hospital. You're going to help maintain the veteran memorials you've been vandalizing, and you're going to show proper respect to every veteran you encounter." The Marines had coordinated with local veteran organizations to create a comprehensive community service program that would expose the teenagers to the reality of military service and sacrifice. They would spend their afternoons and weekends working with veterans, learning their stories and understanding the true cost of the freedom they had taken for granted. But first, Santos added, "You're going to apologize to Gunnery Sergeant Adams, in person with sincerity and with a full understanding of what you did wrong." The teenagers were escorted by the Marines to Walter's apartment, where the 90-year-old veteran was tending to his injuries and trying to process the trauma of his assault. When Walter opened his door to find Tyler Morrison standing there with tears streaming down his face, flanked by 12 Marines, he understood immediately that justice had been served. "Sir," Tyler said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I want to apologize for what I did to you today. I was wrong, I was disrespectful, and I'm ashamed of my behavior. You deserve better from me, and I promise it will never happen again." Walter looked at the young man who had terrorized him just hours earlier, seeing not the bully who had pushed him into traffic, but a frightened teenager who was finally understanding the consequences of his actions. "Son, apology accepted. But I want you to understand something. When you disrespected me, you disrespected every Marine who ever served, every veteran who sacrificed for this country, and every family who lost a loved one in defense of freedom." The encounter between Walter and his attackers, mediated by the Marines who had intervened on his behalf, became a powerful lesson in accountability, redemption, and the bonds that unite those who serve. It was also the beginning of a transformation that would change not only the lives of 5 troubled teenagers, but the entire community of Millbrook. The real test of the Marines' intervention came over the following weeks as Tyler Morrison and his crew were required to follow through on their commitment to community service and respectful behavior. The Marines had established a comprehensive monitoring system with different members of their group, checking in on the teenagers' progress and ensuring that their transformation was genuine rather than merely performative. Gunnery Sergeant Jackson had coordinated with the local VA hospital to create meaningful volunteer opportunities that would expose the teenagers to the reality of military service and sacrifice. Tyler found himself assigned to the physical therapy ward, where he helped elderly veterans with their rehabilitation exercises and heard their stories of combat survival and resilience. The experience was transformative in ways that Tyler could never have anticipated. Working with Master Sergeant Robert Chen, no relation to Marcus, a Vietnam veteran who had lost both legs to a landmine, Tyler began to understand the true cost of military service. Chen's patience and dignity in the face of his disabilities stood in stark contrast to Tyler's own self-pity and anger about his relatively minor problems. "You remind me of myself at your age," Chen told Tyler during one of their sessions, "angry at the world looking for someone to blame for my problems, thinking that strength meant hurting people who couldn't fight back. The military taught me that real strength comes from protecting those who need protection, not from preying on the vulnerable." Marcus Chen was assigned to work with the Korean War veterans, helping them with basic tasks and listening to their stories about a conflict that most Americans had forgotten. His own grandfather's tales of fleeing communist China took on new meaning as he heard about American soldiers who had died defending South Korea's freedom. Jamie Rodriguez found himself working in the hospital's psychiatric ward, assisting veterans who were struggling with PTSD and other mental health issues. The experience of seeing grown men reduced to tears by memories of combat gave him a new perspective on courage and vulnerability that challenged everything he thought he knew about masculinity and strength. Devin Williams was assigned to the prosthetics department, where he helped veterans learn to use artificial limbs and adaptive equipment. The patience and determination shown by men who had lost arms and legs in service to their country made his own problems seem trivial by comparison. Alex Thompson, whose wealthy background had insulated him from the consequences of his actions, was assigned to work with homeless veterans, helping to serve meals and provide basic services to men and women who had served their country but fallen through the cracks of society. But the most significant test came when the teenagers were required to participate in the annual Veterans Day ceremony, where they would publicly acknowledge their wrongdoing and demonstrate their commitment to honoring those who had served. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of veterans and their families, including many who had been terrorized by Tyler's crew over the previous months. Walter Adams, despite his age and the trauma of his assault, insisted on participating in the ceremony. He had asked to speak about forgiveness, redemption, and the importance of giving young people second chances when they demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to change. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walter said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "3 weeks ago, I was assaulted by a group of teenagers who saw me as nothing more than a target for their anger and frustration. Today, those same young men are here to honor veterans and to demonstrate that people can change when they're given the opportunity and the guidance they need." The teenagers took turns speaking about what they had learned from their experience working with veterans. Tyler's speech was particularly powerful as he described how his work at the VA hospital had opened his eyes to the reality of service and sacrifice. "I thought I was tough because I could push around old people and intimidate anyone who seemed weak." Tyler said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "But working with real veterans, hearing their stories, seeing their courage in the face of disability and trauma, that showed me what real toughness looks like. I'm ashamed of what I did, but I'm grateful for the chance to learn and to serve." The climactic moment came when Tyler presented Walter with a specially commissioned plaque honoring his service at Iwo Jima, Korea, in Vietnam. The plaque had been funded by the teenagers' own money earned through their volunteer work, and it represented their commitment to honoring rather than disrespecting those who had served. The true test of the transformation came 6 months after the initial incident, when Tyler Morrison and his former crew faced their biggest challenge yet. A new group of teenagers had moved into the area, and they had begun terrorizing elderly residents in the same way that Tyler's group had done before their encounter with the Marines. The new group, led by an 18-year-old named Derek Walsh, who had recently moved to Millbrook from another state, had specifically targeted Walter Adams, apparently viewing the elderly Marine as an easy mark. They had followed him home from the grocery store, taunting him with the same kind of cruel language that Tyler had once used. But this time, Walter wasn't alone. Tyler Morrison, who had been walking nearby after finishing his volunteer shift at the VA hospital, witnessed the harassment and immediately intervened. "Hey," Tyler called out, approaching the group with the kind of confidence that came from months of working with veterans and understanding what real courage looked like. "Leave him alone." Derek Walsh, who was bigger and older than Tyler, laughed at the intervention. "Who's going to make me little boy? You want to protect your grandfather here." Tyler's response revealed how completely he had been transformed by his experience. "That's Gunnery Sergeant Walter Adams, United States Marine Corps Purple Heart recipient and veteran of Iwo Jima. He's earned more respect in one day of service than you'll earn in your entire life. And yes, I'm going to protect him." The confrontation escalated when Derek shoved Tyler, expecting him to back down, as he had when facing the Marines months earlier. Instead, Tyler stood his ground, drawing on the lessons he had learned about courage, honor, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "You think you're tough?" Tyler asked, echoing the words that Gunnery Sergeant Jackson had once used with him. "You think terrorizing old men makes you a warrior? Let me tell you what tough really looks like." Tyler began describing Walter's service record, painting the same picture of heroism and sacrifice that the Marines had once painted for him. But more importantly, he called for backup, using the network of support that the Marines had helped him build within the veteran community. Within minutes, Marcus Chen, Jamie Rodriguez, Devin Williams, and Alex Thompson had arrived on the scene, all of them prepared to defend Walter Adams and confront the new group of bullies. But they weren't alone. Several veterans from the VA hospital, alerted by Tyler's call, had also responded to support their elderly comrade. The sight of Tyler's transformed crew standing shoulder to shoulder with combat veterans to protect Walter Adams was so powerful that Derek Walsh and his group retreated without further confrontation. They had expected to find easy victims. Instead, they had discovered a community that protected its own. The incident marked the complete transformation of Tyler Morrison and his former crew from community menaces into community protectors. Their intervention on behalf of Walter Adams demonstrated that their change was genuine and permanent, earning them the respect and acceptance of the veteran community they had once terrorized. Gunnery Sergeant Jackson, who had orchestrated the original intervention, was promoted to first sergeant and used Tyler's story as an example in his work with troubled youth throughout the region. The success of the Millbrook intervention became a model for other Marine Corps units dealing with similar community problems. Walter Adams, rather than being traumatized by his assault, found new purpose in mentoring the young men who had once been his tormentors. He began speaking at schools and community centers about forgiveness, redemption, and the importance of giving people second chances when they demonstrated genuine commitment to change. Tyler Morrison graduated from high school and enlisted in the Marine Corps, inspired by his work with veterans and his desire to serve something greater than himself. His transformation from bully to protector became legendary within Marine Corps recruiting circles, and he eventually returned to Millbrook as a recruiter himself. Marcus Chen used his experience working with Korean War veterans to reconnect with his own family's history, eventually becoming a historian specializing in Asian American military service. His grandfather's stories of fleeing communist China took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of American veterans who had fought to preserve freedom around the world. Jamie Rodriguez channeled his experience working with PTSD patients into a career in mental health counseling, specializing in helping veterans cope with trauma in transition to civilian life. His own troubled background gave him unique insight into the challenges faced by people trying to overcome their past mistakes. Devin Williams became a prosthetist, using his experience at the VA hospital to help veterans adapt to life with disabilities. His work designing and fitting artificial limbs became his way of giving back to the community that had shown him what real service looked like. Alex Thompson used his family's wealth to establish a foundation supporting veteran services and youth intervention programs. The foundation funded similar programs in communities across the country, spreading the model of accountability and redemption that had transformed his own life. The Marine Corps recruiting station in Millbrook became a pilgrimage site for law enforcement agencies and community organizations seeking to replicate the success of the intervention. Staff Sergeant Santos, who had coordinated the original response, was promoted and assigned to develop similar programs throughout the Marine Corps. The corner of Main and Elm, once a gathering place for troublemakers and bullies, was renamed Gunnery Sergeant Walter Adams Corner, in honor of the veteran whose assault had sparked such positive change. A small memorial plaque told the story of how one man's courage in the face of adversity had transformed an entire community. Most importantly, the incident established a new understanding in Millbrook about the treatment of veterans and elderly residents. The community that had once tolerated the harassment of its most vulnerable members became a model of respect and protection, with young people competing to volunteer at veteran services and honor those who had served. Walter Adams lived to see his 95th birthday, surrounded by the young men who had once been his tormentors, but had become his protectors and friends. His story became a testament to the power of forgiveness, the importance of accountability, and the unbreakable bonds that unite those who understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice. The Marines who had intervened on Walter's behalf remained connected to the community they had helped transform, returning regularly to check on the veterans they had sworn to protect and the young men they had helped to redeem. Their intervention had proven that the values of honor, courage, and commitment extended far beyond the battlefield, creating lasting change in the lives of everyone they touched.